All right, everybody, welcome back. So in the last video, I talked a lot about welding theory. This time I want to talk about welding practice. So how you're actually going to make these welds and what a good weld is versus a bad weld, and also what my expectations are for the welds that you make. So, the first step is striking an arc. And when you strike an arc, there's two methods to strike an arc. There's the tap method, which would be, the scratch method, which would be running along a piece like this and then lifting up a little bit. Then there's the tap method, which would be tapping and then lifting up a little bit like this. When you're just starting out, I will tell you the scratch method is going to be your easiest one to use. Okay, all of you are going to, I'm going to send this welding table home for those of you that don't have a spot to weld. You can scratch all over the welding table to strike your arc, that's fine. I'll go over some of that stuff when I'm going to send home on the next video. But especially if you're using this 110 volt welder, the tap method doesn't work very well. I found it's just not powerful enough to create a long enough arc. And so even I, an experienced welder, had to use the scratch method over and over to make a good bead with it. When you're striking your arc length is going to matter. And this is really where the skill in welding comes in, because we need to keep our arc at a certain length. And a good gauge for the length of the arc is the diameter of the rod. So like if I'm using a rod like this, that's about how far I want my rod to be away from the piece when I'm welding it. And it doesn't sound too hard. The thing is, there's two things happening at once. First, you're forming your puddle, which we'll talk about next, and also the rod's being consumed. And so as the rod's being consumed, you have to try to maintain that arc length. If it gets too long, your arc will start arcing down in different spots. If it gets too short, our arc won't be very hot anymore, and we're not going to have much melting of the base metal, and so our weld won't be very strong. So maintaining that arc length is critical to having a good weld. Now, if you're welding in a 110 volt welder, welding with a skinny rod like this, now our arc length is only really, less than 1/8 of an inch. This welder will be more challenging to maintain an arc width than a larger 220 volt welder will be. Once you have your arc established, then it's all about forming the bead, it's called. And what the bead is the molten puddle that you create along the weld. If you can imagine as you're welding, and if you want to, you can watch YouTube videos of welding, and I thought about making some welding, but I didn't think they'd turn out with the camera equipment that we had. So all you're doing is creating a molten pool of metal, and you're going to keep forming that molten pool of metal along the piece of steel that you're welding as you go. Well, as you're forming that molten pool of metal, as you go, the pool starts solidifying behind you. And so as that pool keeps solidifying, our bead starts to form. And what we should end up with is a bead of consistent width and height. And so you can see over here, I made a bead out of some 5/16 washers. And really what this is meant to symbolize is, it's meant to symbolize as the puddle cools, every time it cools, it creates a new ring in the bead. And we want the bead to be uniform as far as width goes, and we want it to be the same height as we go. So, Dina, if you can get really close to this one, if you look at this bead right here, you can see that there's little ridges in it. Those little ridges are just like the washers that I laid down right there. The bead is uniform in height and in width as we go. Until we achieve the ability to be able to just make a bead like that, we're not really ready to weld yet. So, how do you know what a bead should be? Well, generally speaking, the rod that you're using, your bead should be 2 rods wide. So if you look like at this one that I made here, you can see that my bead is approximately 2 rods wide. That's what we're looking for. The height of the bead should be about half the height of the rod. A little bit less is better too, that's fine. But these are just recommendations that are a good place to start. If I turn this over and you look on the other side I welded these up with a 110 volt welder. You can look, yeah, I'm probably about 2 beads wide there with my bead. It's going to be a lot smaller bead. Okay, so that's what we're looking for as far as bead size and bead quality go. The first thing I'm going to have you do when you start welding is you're going to get a piece of 1/4 inch steel like this, and it's going to be your arc pad. So this is what I'm going to want you to do is practice running some beads. Now I only ran 2 beads on this thing. I'm expecting you to fill up a whole side of this thing, maybe even the other side as well, because it takes practice in order to be able to do this well. If it's not going right, if after 2 or 3, 4 rods you still aren't gaining any traction on having things look like this, then it's time to talk to your welding mentor or me, and we'll try to figure out what's going on. It's possible that we don't have the welder set right, we might have some rod issues or something like that, or it's just plain old hand speed and arc length problems is the problems you're going to run into. My experience has been when teaching people how to weld here the last 17 years is that students generally want to weld really fast. And so the beads they make don't end up looking anything like this when they start out with, because they race from one side of the piece to the other. If your bead is not at least this wide, you're not going fast enough. Okay, you need to make sure, or you're not going slow enough, I'm sorry. Excuse me. Students usually go too fast, they don't go slow enough. So you need to slow down, make sure you're giving that bead time to form, and bring it across the piece. After we're done with that, then I'm going to have some welds that I want you to perform. And so the first weld is called the butt weld, and all that is just 2 pieces of steel butted together, and then you're going to run a bead right down the middle of them. That's going to be our first weld, is the butt weld. After that, we'll do the lap weld. This is a lap weld right here. A lap weld is 2 pieces just lapped on top of each other, and then we do a bead right here along those 2. And the last one will be a T-weld. A T-weld will look like this. The T-weld is the most challenging one. The piece should be straight up and down. The weld should be 45-degree at a 45-degree angle. The bead should be in relation to the parts. And those will be the 3 welds that I want you to do in the arc process. Okay. That should be it for today, everybody. Thank you.